video really on what we mean by the Terms of Trade Index, and it's an important index because it takes the idea of comparative advantage, where if you remember you had two PPF curves for two different countries, and what you could do is you could prove that there were gains from trade if you were able to have a trading ratio between the two opportunity cost ratios. But that trading ratio is in terms of giving up one good for another good. So it is a bit like bartering. You know, I'll give you a TV if you give me some washing machines. This takes it into the real world, because what this says is that when we specialize as a country, we make our goods, we export them, and then I earn a price for that good, and then I go into the international market and I buy imports with it. So, a simple example, if the export prices of my goods were £2, every export I sold, I'd get £2 for it, and then I'd go into the market and I'd be able to buy 2 imports. So it's important that you can read it in that way, and it is important that you spot that it's prices, because a common mistake is that it is value, and that is not so. So don't get confused here at this point and talk about the value of exports or imports, okay? It's prices that you've got to use. So what happens if, for example, the ratio rises? So this is the example that we had, a rise in the index, and the first thing we're going to look at is a rise in the export prices. A rise in the imports index will mean that there's an improvement for the country because I can buy more imports. So in this case here, every time I sold an export, I could buy 2 imports. If the price of exports go up to £4, I can buy 4 imports with it, okay, with every export. Now, it could also mean, another way of looking at it, and worth sort of extending your analysis if you were writing this, it could mean that you export fewer goods to buy the same number of imports. So here, initially, I had to sell 1 export, gave myself £2, and then I could buy 2 imports. Whereas if the price of exports has gone to 4, when I sell my export I get £4, so I only have to sell half an export, getting £2, to then go into the market and buy 2 imports. So whichever way you want to look at it, it's going to raise the living standards of the country, because you're getting either more imports, that's an increase in the number of goods and services that your consumers can consume, or you're not exporting as many, and so again, that's an increase in living standards. Okay, so you link this to the living standard of the country. There's more goods available, and that's real GDP, the volume of goods that are available to your consumers. Okay, all right. What would happen then if there's a fall in the index? Well, a fall in the index is detrimental, because what it means is that you've got to sell, okay, more of these exports. So if imports are £1 and I'm only getting £1 for my exports now, instead of just selling 1 and being able to buy my 2 imports, here I have to sell 2 exports to gain 2 imports. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. The other way of looking at it is that you could export the same, but then you afford to buy fewer imports. So here, before the index fell, okay, to this 1-to-1, I used to buy 2 imports when I was selling an export. So I sold my export, got my 2 imports. Now I sell an export and I can only buy 1 import. So whatever happens, the standard of living will worsen if the Terms of Trade Index falls. Now, one of the problems with that is, and we're going to come on to this and look at it now, is that we are assuming in that when the prices change, the quantities don't change. Okay, so that you must sort of make sure the examiner sees that that's a hidden assumption in what you've just said. So let's have a look to start, though, at what are the factors that influence this index. So we're only looking at what would cause a rise in the price of exports. Okay, and the first thing, which I put here, is that an increase in exchange rates would do that. So if the exchange rate goes up, then the price of your goods sold in foreign markets will also go up. As I say, that is an increase in the terms of trade ratio, which is meant to be beneficial. Now, that might sound very strange to you because you're making that assumption that you do not change the quantity at that point. Okay, Another thing, if you've got high relative inflation, it means that the price of your exports are going up faster than the price of your imports, because your inflation is higher than your competitors' inflation, or where you're buying your imports from, and so the price of exports rise, which means that there's an improvement in the terms of trade. So you can see that this is counterintuitive because of that assumption that you are selling the same number of goods. There could be an increase in the global demand for exported goods. So if that was the case, the price of your exports would rise. And that is more intuitive because you're saying there that for some reason outside the price of your goods, there's an increase in demand, and so the price of your exports has risen, so has the quantity demanded of your exports. So that's a shift out of your demand curve for exports. So that's a little bit more intuitive, if you like. There could be a decrease in the global supply for your imported goods, so that the price of your imports, the bottom part, goes down. So if the bottom part of the equation goes down, the whole thing goes up. Okay. Another one that isn't really intuitive is that if you have worse productivity, your unit costs rise, and so therefore your price of your exports rise. And so that's a good thing, because you're assuming that if your productivity goes down, unit costs rise, and therefore you will have to increase the selling price of your goods in the market. And it could be an increasing world income for the goods that this country has produced. And again, that's an increase in global demand. Depends on your income elasticity of demand would be a good thing to say there. But really what you're saying is that if there's an increase in the demand, then the price of your exports will rise, and so will your quantity. Okay. So now we get to a tricky bit where we have to say, well, let's take an increase in the terms of trade and let's see whether or not it does improve the economy. And mainly what we do is we look at all the government objectives. So the first one, we've said before, it will improve the standard of living. Fewer exports are needed for the same, to get the same number of imports, or more imports can be bought with every exported good. So whatever you do there, talk about the living standards and talk about how you measure living standards, and it's more goods and services that are available to be consumed by the population in your country. Okay, this is where it gets tricky. So a rise in the terms of trade is likely, ceteris paribus, important assumption, to improve. Okay, because the export prices will rise, and so in a very simple world, if your export prices rise, the value of your exports rise. But you'll see here I've put some elastic and inelastic demand curves because we need to consider this a little bit more. So the assumption is that it will rise, the value of exports will rise when the price of your exports rise, but only if the demand is inelastic. Okay, so we'll see this in a minute in these diagrams. So if you have an elastic demand here, when that price rises, you're going to lose as a country a lot of demand for your exports. So if you remember from year one, you should say that this is the gain in the revenue that the producer gets, and that's the loss in the revenue that the producer gets. So overall, you're going to see that as the price rises, we're going to lose some revenue. In this diagram, when it's inelastic, the increase in the quantity here, the increase in the price is going to be very large, and we will only lose a small amount of our demand. So in that case, spending on exports here will rise. In this case, spending on exports is going to fall. So in other words, when the price of the export rises, because the terms of trade have increased, the increase in the price is going to be proportionately more than the fall in the quantity, or the alternative is, you can say it that way, okay? Which means that the revenue that is being spent on your exports is going to rise, which will therefore improve your balance of payments. So this is only a positive because we're doing analysis saying it is a positive thing. It's only positive if you have inelastic PED. Okay. Take the import side. It says again, the current account is going to improve as the import prices fall. So remember, the terms of trade ratio could rise because the lower part, has gone down, and so less is spent on imports. But again, it's to do with the elasticity in the of the PED. So take this one here. The price has fallen here in the market, the price of imports. That means that we buy loads more imports. Therefore, you have these two boxes again, that the value of imports, we lose this much, but we gain that much. In other words, the revenue that we spend on imports is actually going to be bigger. So when it's elastic, that's not going to help to improve the balance of payments. Okay, but if it's inelastic, a fall in the price of your imports leads to an increase in the price of quantity of imports. You will lose a huge amount of spending on your imports here, but you will gain some more spending. But the spending on imports is going to fall when it's inelastic. So the current account will improve as import prices fall, as long as you have inelastic PD for your imports. So it's the same PD that we're looking for exports and imports if you're looking for an improvement in your current account. Okay. All right. What about the other objectives? Well, real output will rise if your X and M is rising because you have inelastic PED. Then the AD curve is going to shift to the right, and that means your real output goes up, and there's some economic growth coming through. It'll mean that inflation might fall if your price of imports falls. That's another positive. You have less cost push inflation. If your real output rises, the employment rises as well. And if employment rises, unemployment falls. So all of those things, you've now hit living standards, balance of payments, economic growth, employment, unemployment, and inflation in that whole analysis. So we need to evaluate that. Lastly, so remember, the current account will worsen if the PED is elastic. So you can go back to what we were just saying. If the price of the exports rise, and we lose a lot of demand for them, then the value of exports is going to go down. Okay. The current account is going to worsen if the PED of imports is elastic. In other words, we drop the price of imports coming into our country, but there's a massive increase in the quantity of imports, so therefore the value is going to rise. So it's not going to it's not going to improve the current account. The current account is going to worsen if you have elastic PED for X and elastic PED for imports. Another one, if the real output is going to fall because, again, X minus M is going to worsen, aggregate demand is going to shift in. If it's elastic, so employment will fall and unemployment will rise. And on the inflation one, inflation is rise if this X minus M improves, it's inelastic, because you get some demand pull inflation. Okay, so those are the evaluation points that you can make, and there's just one more that you can think about, which if you want to extend your analysis, you can with this. We always say that when aggregate demand shifts to the right, because the value of X minus M is rising, then we get economic growth. Okay, but we'll see this in a minute. Okay, we say that employment rises and we say that unemployment falls. But let's think about this. The orange ones are the evaluation of those points. Whenever you shift your AD to the right, you can't always say that real output rises. It might be that you've got a small output gap, i.e. you're very close to full employment, and so the increase in aggregate demand in the Keynesian diagram does not increase real output. You could argue that there's a long-run aggregate supply curve that is vertical, a classical economics argument, and so you should always look at those two different AS curves when you're evaluating this. The next thing we said was that employment rises. Well, does employment have to rise every time output rises? Can we get an increase in output without an increase in employment? And the answer is that you can. Okay, You could have productivity gains. That's the one thing that you really need to talk about, that output could go up. You don't need to pull in extra workers. You might bring in capital. That's one thing. Or you just might mean that your productivity of your labour increases, so you get more out of every worker, so you don't need to increase employment. And then there's a link always between rising employment and unemployment falling. But where does that employment come from? It might come from overseas workers coming into work. It might be that people from outside the workforce, so people who've retired, are coming back in and taking those jobs. It might be that those people, if you remember, who are not in the workforce, they're economically inactive, they come in and they take the jobs, so the unemployment figures will not go down. So it's a tricky concept. Work through that very carefully, and particularly be able to work through the PEDs being elastic and inelastic. But the summary is that as long as the PED of exports and the PED of imports is inelastic, then a rise in the terms of trade is going to be beneficial to your current account. It's going to improve the current account. That then shifts the AD curve to the right. That leads to real national output, economic growth. That leads to an increase in employment and a reduction in unemployment. And then you have to go through, yes, but it's only if these certain assumptions hold. So hopefully that's of help.